Is humanity teaching the right kind of revolutionary optimism in school curriculums? What are some of the hidden signifiers about the private school systems in Sweden? Is China really socialist? These are some of the questions I discuss in this podcast or vodcast, so stay tuned if any of those interest you. I'm your host, Monu Singh. Welcome to another episode of Earthspeak. Now, before I introduce the guests who I had a discussion with and I propose these questions, I just want to make a disclaimer in the beginning. I come into this topic with a curious mind. I don't have a personal stake or any kind of personal position on the subject myself, certainly not qualified to be. And it was primarily the reason why this podcast is here in the first place, is to educate myself, first and foremost. It was also an opportunity to bring these two like-minded individuals together, as well as gain some personal insights into their lives. I've been acquainted with them for a while, and I wanted to give them a chance to talk about a subject that often gets demonized. We opened the dialogue by getting a sense of a few personal orientations, starting with Elias, who is a student at the Linnaeus University here in Sweden, and he's lived in Germany before that, where he grew up, and he's been a member of the international Marxist tendency for the last 2.5 years, and worked with the Swedish and German section of that organization. He has written a few articles for the Swedish section and is currently working on translating a German pamphlet on the Biennio Rosso. I hope I got that right. It's the 2 red years in Italy, and he's currently translating that into Swedish. Adele is a Marxist researcher whose work includes examination of Marxism and religion and language nationalism in Sweden. She's currently working on community defense, national struggle, and the Muslim Ummah. Here we go.
Yeah, in high school I was a little bit apolitical, and you get a lot of documentations and you learn a lot about basic politics, and that was already enough to convince me that the system wasn't really doing it for me. Because we learned a lot about global warming, of course, very central issue. Nobody was doing anything about it. Everybody could see that, and I was disappointed in the politics and the experts. Then I also learned about the debt that Germany has. We don't have the same problem in Sweden. Sweden has a comparably low state debt, but like in Germany, it's so large we can't ever pay it off. And like when I'm gonna be 60 or when I'm gonna be 70, I'm not gonna get money from the state to survive. I'm gonna have to pay money for the state to survive. And that was kind of very disillusioning for me. So in the beginning stages of that, I was kind of like against government funding, because that's where I personally saw the problem with the state debt. For example, I thought, okay, the state obviously doesn't know what they're doing. So obviously I didn't move in the direction of Marxism. I wouldn't say I moved directly opposite, but I moved a little bit more in the liberal way and saw like, okay, back in the day, we didn't have all these problems. Like the problem is modernity. The problem is neoliberalism. The problem is the feminazis. This was in 2016, where like the only videos I would get up on YouTube, even before I came into the scene, was like feminazi destroyed, like, oh my god, they used the white guilt against us and stuff like that, because that was the only thing you got on the algorithm. Like, I wouldn't get anything else even if I tried. And I wouldn't say I got active or anything. I just watched some of these videos and I was like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That's the problem. Modernity, weak men. Good times create weak men create bad times create strong men. I believed in this type of just idiotic dipshit talk. Sorry for the language. Yeah, and a friend of mine actually, he went a little bit crazier than me. At one point, he was a monarchist. Yeah, really interesting. But then after a while, I kind of noticed like they didn't have any solutions as well. They just bitched around all the time, but they didn't do anything against the system. They didn't have any solutions to offer. So I kind of got a little bit less interested in politics as a whole too. I kind of got back into that apolitical sphere. And then after a little bit of time, I got more interested in politics again, because, you know, this was the time where I basically was like nihilistic. I was like, global warming exists, we're all gonna die. I'm okay with it. And then after a while, I heard more about people who did offer solutions. And I became more interested in that fear of Marxism, also anarchism, and a lot of different stuff on that angle. And then I started to inform myself a little bit more. That was around the time when I moved to Sweden. And through some friends who joined the International Marxist Tendency in Germany, I found the EMT and started talking, with them. And then I joined the EMT and started reading all sorts of Marxist books. And here I am, basically.
What's the EMT, just for the audience and for myself?
The International Marxist Tendency, which is active in a lot of countries. And I guess you could describe us as a Trotskyist organization. A lot of people do that. And yeah, we organize around a lot of Marxist stuff.
Yeah, so I come from quite an environmentalist, anarchist background. And so I became the black sheep of my family when I started voting for the Social Democrats. So just bringing in the state in that way. Reactionary of me, I guess, from that, you know. So I started to believe in statist solutions in my early 20s. And then I went to university, and the Marxist thinkers appealed to me. So I would have probably described myself academically as sympathetic to these structuralist Marxist perspectives. But I wouldn't have gone much further than this, and I would have voted for Labour, probably still would. And then it was interesting because what happened was I was going to these meetings, these socialist meetings at the campus, and the war in Libya had just broken out. And it was the time of the Arab Spring. We're going back a bit now, you know. So there was this talk of the Arab Spring, and some of these movements looked to be workers based. You know, you had young people crying out for graduate jobs and so forth. And since then, I think we've started calling it the Arab Sting, because a lot of these movements didn't turn out to be very progressive. But what I was certain of at that moment was that whatever was happening in Libya was not so simple, because I knew that the achievements of Libya were substantial. And I suggested this to the socialist gathering, and it didn't go down very well. So I connected with people who agreed there was something up with the Libya. It might actually be an imperialist conquest, and I found Marxist Leninists, and at the same time I thought to myself, you know, again, still in this kind of sphere of, you know, anarchism and environmentalism. It's kind of very simple. Radlib is the term that we'd use. Radical liberalism. You know, my family were just the kind of family that would dare to have a copy of Nelson Mandela on the bookshelf. And so I thought to myself, you know, if we're going in and we're taking out another anti-colonial leader, I want to know what this man is about before my taxes are used to destroy that country. And so I sat with the Green Book, Gaddafi's Green Book. It's not a very good book. It's rather anarchist. But I wanted to know what this man was about. And someone came up to me, a very close friend of mine, and he said, Stalinist. And I was like, you know, there is nothing wrong with reading the book of an anti-colonial African leader. You're not going to tell me otherwise. And he said, well, if you're not a Stalinist, condemn Stalin. And I was like, you know, Gaddafi doesn't have anything to do with Marxism, communism, Stalin. This is a very strange conversation. But this was his position. Condemn, and I said at the time, I said, I won't condemn a man until I know what he's written. And the same applies to this Stalin chap you keep on going on about. I haven't read his work, so I won't condemn him either. And he said, well, you're a Stalinist then. And so at that moment, I realized what all of this anti-Stalinism was about. You just mustn't go there. There's a line in the sand. You can study some Marxist thinkers at school. You can become something vague, socialist. You can even be a Trotskyist selling newspapers on the street corner. But you mustn't read Stalin. And I was meeting Marxist-Leninists, and so I just thought, okay, this is a discourse, you know. So I decided to go to Cuba and see what socialism was all about. And I went on a brigade with the Cuban Solidarity campaign. And one day I was in this school, and it had everything that my kids had at their school. And in fact, it had more than we had at our local schools. And it was a third world country, you know, it's a poor country, but they'd made sure that these kids had a free school lunch and the technology they needed, you know, for good studies, the right kind of tools for play, the right kind of space, green space, playground. I mean, it was just incredible that they had managed to have everything that you really needed, even in this very poor country. And I thought, okay, if they can achieve this in a poor country, what would our schools look like if we invested the same in education? And I thought, if this is communism, you know, this is not so scary. And I just came back unapologetic ever since.
So there's a saying that the one thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from it. I was curious, what part of school curriculums actually advance Marxist ideology in history classes, and how much of it gets left behind? So we start with how Adele's experience was during high school.
Yeah, so I think at high school level, there are progressive teachers who really want to talk about the structural analysis, and particularly my sociology teacher and my history teacher, they would introduce us to two Marxist thinkers as part of the curriculum, but not really emphasize that they were Marxist, just that they were foundational thinkers in these fields of modern history and sociology. And so there's this kind of reframing, and there's also the teacher that encourages you to think about the problems. And, you know, so of course, you know, this idea of, we might have heard from the internet, of cultural Marxism, you know, it doesn't really happen like that. But a teacher will ask you to think about the things that matter, and you know, and of course, critical thinking skills are what teachers are encouraging, really. But that's I think what's going on at high school level. Although I know in some countries, like in Sweden, there has been some discouragement of young people producing leftist analysis at that high school level, which is, I don't think that would happen in Britain. So it's sad to see that kind of Germanic attitude barring children from exploring these themes. At university, of course, there's academic Marxism. It usually comes in the form of a critical week as part of a broader module. And so you will be introduced to some Marxist thinkers, but they will not be put into the context of what kind of Marxist they are, and it will just be relevant to the course. So academic Marxism follows its own path, really. I was lucky. I don't know how this happened, but I was lucky enough to have a book like State and Revolution on my reading list. Those two Marxist worlds don't really find each other. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like looking into a mirror of my experiences. In high school, I didn't have the same that you had with Marxist thinkers. I think it's a little bit more taboo, I would say, in Germany to talk about the Marxist thinkers in general, because we have history with the DDR, of course, and the RAF, Rote Armee-Fraktion, if you know it. Okay, it was basically a communist group in BRD who like kidnapped and killed a bunch of people and stuff like that. And they aren't really, I mean, I wouldn't support them because their actions were, like a terrorist organization, which is not what we are trying to do. I mean, you haven't told me your position on this, but like, your positions make it seem like you're not a terrorist. Yeah, what we are trying to do is organizing together and not just killing people or kidnapping people or stuff like that. I mean, we are the people who get kidnapped mostly. In school, I liked history, but the only things we were taught were always just the dates of certain things, and we were told about the great people of history like Napoleon and Stalin, and these were the people who made history with their own hands, and we were never taught the underlying reasons behind it. We were never taught basically the Marxist view to view history, which is understandable why we weren't taught it, but we weren't taught history like, we weren't taught to understand history. We were just taught history. And that's why I love Marxism, because it teaches us not just history in general, what happened, but it teaches us how to understand history, how to put it into a context. I really like about Marxism and what I didn't have in school. And then in university, of course, I also got some Marxist thinkers, but like you said, academic Marxism, like Adorno or Lukács are the ones I remember the most. And it's really weird because it's not really the Marxism that we really practice in our activism. Because what we really think about when we do Marxism is dialectical materialism. And we can go into this aspect of it later down the line. It's basically philosophy and theory related to the real world. It always needs to have the real world context. It can't be like discoupled from reality. And many of these academic Marxists, when I read their texts, it feels like it's just completely devoid of reality. It feels like it's something way different, which doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but it's like a very, very different approach.
Now that we've talked about schools, let's move the trajectory to the political arena and try to understand how this gets deployed more broadly. And this is keeping in mind we have a welfare state like Sweden being a little resilient with curiosity with Marxist views and distinctions, if there are any, for discussion. So I wanted to kind of get an idea of the advantages or disadvantages, if any.
I mean, we can kind of like all surmise some things by looking at the election, which is gonna happen like a month from now. And we can already see how the parties are reacting right now. A lot of them, like I think almost every party in Sweden, has taken a turn for the right. Like the Vänster has become more right-wing. Nooshi Dadgostar, the leader of the Vänster party here in Sweden, the left party, she just straight up said that all the socialist content of their party program is a thing of the past. She said we should take all that out, which is of course a gigantic right-wing stance for the left, for that party. It's a complete shift, a complete 180. And then we can talk about the Socialdemokraterna, Sossarna, who now have started using really racist rhetoric, like many other parties too. Yeah, the Social Democrats, Sossarna, who are in power right now, who also made like the NATO ansökan. They want to be a part of NATO, which is of course extremely reactionary. And we kind of see the shift in at least the parties. Then when we look at the people, it's a little bit different, of course. And we can discuss how that's going to look. But that's a rather complex question.
Yes, obviously, you know, it's still got a reputation across the world for being progressive, for being an alternative to socialism, which is usually how it's portrayed. You know, we have this caring capitalism, so we mustn't think about the revolutionary solution. And in some ways it's sad to dispel this myth, because it's useful for some campaigns in the Anglosphere to talk about alternative policies. But as we live in Sweden, we obviously know that neoliberalism has seriously bitten, and these progressive policies are few and far between. And Sweden was a very different place 20 years ago. A lot of the social democratic policy that was benefiting the employment industry and has depleted. And the Nordic countries seem as bureaucratically clogged with neoliberalism as any other country.
Even worse in some cases, like when I look at how Germany handled the corona pandemic, and when I look at Sweden's corona pandemic strategy, I would say even Germany handled it better. I would say even Germany seems more socialist in this specific example. And like I told you guys before, Sweden is the country where inequality has risen the most in the world in the last 30 years, which is like, I mean, it makes sense because we had a lot of class war back in the day in Sweden, a lot of big conflicts. 1909 was a really big one. The latest really big one was 1980, Storstrejken, where all of Sweden, like I think it was 4 million workers who went out in strike, and like for months they striked. Even the king wanted to do a visit to the UK with an airplane. No airplane flew, not even for the king. It was extremely radical, and like they won a lot in that fight. But after that fight was won, slowly started destroying these victories. And this destroyment of the victories has been going on for the last more than 30 years, where the social areas of Sweden have been attacked, like the schools, the hospitals, the funding in general for the social, for the welfare model that Sweden is modeled after. It has just disappeared and disappeared and disappeared. And if you also look at the Apoteken, which has become more increasingly privatized, if you look at Sweden's private school system, which is actually, I think, the only one in the whole world where there are private schools who get their funding from the state. Yes. And I don't know how much you know about this, but they have scandals like every few months, and it's no wonder, because private schools who get their funding from the state, that's a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for the most idiotic education you can get, because the only thing they care about is having the image, is showing the image they give a good education. But to give a good education, you need to spend money, and that's what these companies don't want to do. They just want to rake in the profits from the state. The profit wants to pay less for education, So they both win, but the kids don't win.
This is important, actually. Sweden has a good track record of creating policy that looks kind of social democratic. And it applies to things like the rebate that we get on our cleaning services and so forth. Right? This sounds progressive because it's, you're going to help these middle, first home owners and so forth. But the thing is that that this has resulted in the price of these services doubling. So and so there is no rebate for the user. You better get your rebate, otherwise you're paying twice the price of anyone else in Europe for a cleaner or a house move or renovations. And so that's one policy that it kind of looks nice, but it was created by the right deliberately to confuse. And the free school system is exactly the same. In Britain, the Conservative Party have recommended introducing this because they are a conservative right-wing party. But Sweden portrayed this, as a progressive move, and it's not. It is just taking money from the state schools. It's very attractive to us. You and I both have children in a private school as a result. And we have, there's a purpose to that. In that we can have a more specialised school than the state school system can offer, but we're just individuals who personally benefit from this. Every child having a voucher that then they can go and shop around for a school with is actually taking money from the state schools, which is obviously not an intention that we had personally when we opted for a private school.
Yeah, of course.
So just giving people this option depletes, just like being able to buy your council home in England was another ploy. It sounds great. I can finally buy a home after living in a council house all these years. But it was a deliberate attempt to deplete the housing stock. And so Sweden are quite sophisticated in thinking of policies that will convince the public, but at the same time, a generation or two, it will have destroyed another social democratic policy.
Yeah, and I have several examples for that too. That's actually a great point, because that's what I find most interesting with Sweden, how they try to portray this image of nice capitalism, but then they do extremely reactionary politic. Even the Social Democrats, especially the Social Democrats, and like it's so transparent if you have the Marxist perspective on it. Like the NATO ansökan, for the first thing, they portray it as if it's something that's needed now to protect against Russia. And like, I don't want to go into it too much, but that's the complete opposite. Like joining NATO doesn't help us protect against Russia, it just helps us attack Russia in a certain way. And then also what you said with the reformist policies. I don't know, do you know Lagen om Anställningsskydd, or for short, laws? That's a law which was won by the workers, I think 1980. It was the Sjöavtalet or something like that. And it's a rule that you can't fire anybody from your company that you want to. There are certain rules you have to follow. One of them is first in, first out. So you can't fire people who have been there for 5 or more years as the first person when there's an economic downturn or something. Which makes sense, because those are the people more prone to organizing. Those are the people that are connected with the workers, who are connected with the unions and stuff too. And of course, like in times of not much class war, the bosses also can they can negotiate with the unions, and mostly they can still fire who they want. In 90% of the times, the unions agree, okay, you can fire this person even though he's been here for a long time now, or you can fire that person. But now, the Swedish bourgeoisie has actually made an attack against Lars. And I think it's in June where the state also said that they're going to support this change of law. And some of the unions too, like Kommunal or EF Metall, which are two of the biggest like unions here in Sweden, they said yes to this immediately. And like the change basically means it becomes way easier to fire people, and it basically means that Lars is made completely useless. Just like better to not have it at all, basically. But they portray it as a modern like betterment of Lars. They say it's to update Lars. And then they also have another compromise, which is the unions say they said yes to this change of plans of laws because the company said they're going to give older workers the opportunity to return to university and to work there and like update their knowledge, which is actually a program which the companies don't pay a dime for. This is a program that the state already said yes to, I think in May or something, and the state is the one who pays for it. And that's why they put on higher CSN loans, like the repayment, like the Zinsen. What's Zinsen in English now again?
CSN is student loans, right? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. It's students' loan, but you have to pay a little bit of money on it every year.
Interest?
Interest,
oh, okay.
Exactly. Like the interest before was 0.001, now it's 0.05/6, and they changed it. They said it's higher, so they can pay. So the state can pay for the people who are older, who want to leave work for only a semester or two to go back to study a little bit. So it's the state who pays for older workers to return to school and not the companies. But the companies say that's something that they're doing as a favor so they can get less. So in every step of the way, there's just like incredibly reactionary policies, and everyone who's involved in them say, yeah, it's a betterment, it's like progressive.
So to bring it back to Marxism,
yeah.
I think it's important to explain the critique here, that we can't just lament the fall of our workers' movement and encourage everyone to have a general strike. We must do that too, of course. But there's something inevitable about this. And at the time of the great threat of revolution, this is when social democracy was founded, to convince workers. And of course they were fighting for many years before this, but to convince workers not to have a revolution that they had witnessed in countries like the USSR or China, they offered these carrots, and of course if you can't exploit your own workers, the incentive is on to exploit other countries' workers, which necessitated a huge increase in imperialist conflicts. And so actually we all benefit when a country has had enough, stands up to imperialism and wins. We all benefit because then their opportunities to leave us stranded with our labour rights here and outsource is stumped, and they have to come back to the table. But the problem is, systemically, we've walked into a situation where even if they would love to give us some social democratic carrots, and these old parties like the Social Democrats, I'm sure they would love to resolve all of Sweden's issues in this way, they can't, because we're now too beholden after neoliberalism. It's a very clever play, but also structurally, capitalism requires growth. And there's a bankruptcy in every city, company, country. If it cannot grow more than last year, then you are officially bankrupt. That's just simply how capitalism works. And so if you run out of opportunities for imperialist conflict, and of course we know we can't win wars anymore. We couldn't win Afghanistan, Syria, so many wars we've tried to have something to do with, and we failed. you know, it's taking longer to complete these wars, and we're failing in the process. So that's not really an option right now. The global south has risen to the point that that's not so easy anymore. And so we're back to how can we exploit the worker within the European nations. And it's just going to get worse from here, because with the best will in the world, the system is bureaucratically clogged. Even if we were all on strike, there's not much they could really do to alleviate that. We need to look structurally and economically at what the opportunities really are outside of this paradigm of capitalist thinking. And that's why we become Marxists. Because we have to dare to think about these alternative models and look at the countries that don't have this problem.
Moving east from the Scandinavian context, I asked Elias and Adele what they think about the country where the Communist Party, that has clearly made some progressive steps in the recent years, both in counteracting its impact on the environment, and it's kind of also responsible at the same time for having the lion's share of the world's most popular consumer products. I guess you must have already guessed the country. I asked them their positions on China.
As a Marxist-Leninist, I do think that China had a socialist revolution, and it has continued to be a socialist country, socialist governance, a socialist economy ever since. And they have overcome a lot of these hurdles. So where we are beholden to companies, we now have to pay companies to stay in our country. Workfare, for example, was invented so that we can pay a company to take on, we pay the worker, they work for the company. And the idea is that that worker might impress the company so much that they are given a job. But that's not the real function of it. The real function is so we can actually pay that company to stay afloat and to stay in our country. And so, so we have this kind of problem over here of this grinding to a halt of the system, And in China, they have I wouldn't say perfected, no socialist project or any government really has perfected anything, it's an ongoing process. But they have addressed this issue that the companies are beholden to the state. If the state decides, actually, we really need to get this done, they know how to make sure that the companies will work for them. And really, if you go to China, you will find a country that is pretty much run on the ground like our countries are. There is the same give or take level of freedom. And certainly, if we examine the different ways in which we are free, you might feel China is less or more free than the West. But, if you go there, you're going to find a very similar society, and you're going to find higher living standards than the West. They've just overtaken the living standards of the West. And really, this change is economic. This is about, the percentage of a company that is in national ownership. What happens to those profits? It's a mechanical thing. And if we think we can do this better than China, if we've got some critique, some bias against something tyrannical we think China has done, we can do it better. It's a technicality that they have fixed this very problem that we are suffering from in the West. So it's definitely worth consulting more with the Chinese about some of these economic principles that they've explored, because they have obviously in record time, look how long it took us to develop industrially, and you see actually the Soviet Union developed like this, we developed like this, and China developed even faster than the industrialized countries did in the 19th century. So this level, this speed of development, this addressing of poverty, it's phenomenal, and there's something to explore. And of course, we read a lot of articles about terrible China, but they seem to have overcome these hurdles. And every year they introduce more progressive policy that we more readily recognize as socialist. They simply had a focus on development in the initial stages, to the point that even we were all confused. Is China still socialist? Has been the question of my political career, if you like.
And they've also managed to do this with the biggest population in the world as well. So,
the only reduction in global poverty we've seen at all, in decades, has been because of the Chinese poverty alleviation program. So nothing else has put a dent in it.
My view, and I'm only speaking for myself now, not for the organization, because I don't have a good enough, I haven't read enough of what my organization believes in on China. But my personal analysis after what I've seen is, I would say, China is something we call a degenerated worker state, which is basically an isolated socialist country in a capitalist world. Often, like, it's tough times, like it's not easy surviving. So it's kind of like, normally a socialist or a communist state is supposed to be built from the ground up, that the workers have total control, and they only, like, the planned economy is built up to what the workers need and what the workers can provide, like each according to the need, each according to their ability, blah blah blah, basic stuff. And degenerated social states, worker states, they often form a sort of bureaucracy which kind of stand above, in a certain way, above the workers, which have their posts, and like they often have a sort of a little bit authoritarian control. And like that's our analysis what happened with the Soviet state, and that's what I think is happening a bit in China. The situation is, of course, very different from the Soviet Union. I think we both agree on that, that it's different than what happened in the Soviet Union. And I think China has come into the capitalist economy, global economy, a little bit with, of course, like they have many companies which also operate on a global scale. And I think it's quite interesting, because I think it's hard to like completely analyze how it works, but I think it makes sense because China fits like a puzzle piece in the modern imperialist global sphere. Because as we've talked about before, there's almost no growth in all economies over the world. In all, like, there's almost no growth in Germany, even though Germany is one of the biggest like economies in Europe. There's almost no growth in even the USA, the biggest point of imperialism, of Western imperialism. And China is the only country which really is progressive in a way, which really has a progressive economy, which has growth. So like, it makes sense that it's kind of fit like a puzzle piece in the imperialist world, that they use imperialism, that imperialism uses them, and that they grow in this way. And I think that's the real reason why like the system is working so smoothly in China at the moment, because very many young economies who just started treading into like the capitalist system have very strong progressive economies. And I think in the future that's where more problem could show up. But I think China is, of course, a step forward in a way. And yeah, what we need is a permanent global revolution to reform China, to reform other socialist states, and yeah, to destroy capitalism once and for all.
There are two ways of understanding China as imperialist. You could say that it's how it's got too much clout in the West. Everything, you know, pick up something that's made of plastic and I'm sure it'll be made in China. So our dependence on China is questionable if it's really an authoritarian regime, you know. There's also the concern about their foreign investments in the global south, which is, of course, a very real question. China's policy on development is a combination of allowing a capitalist economy with a strong focus on nationalization. So a typical company in China will be permitted to operate in a typical capitalist way, but will have a sizable proportion that is nationalized. And they don't really interfere after this. And so this is why you have Chinese companies operating everywhere in the world, because it was their main method for development. And in addition to that, they set up a free economic zone where Western companies were able to operate, and the labor protections that are typical of China were not in effect there. So it was quite a hard place to work, but they've kind of integrated that. Cuba's introduced a similar kind of zone. So this allows Western companies to operate quite freely along free market principles, and it's because obviously the bureaucracy of working between a socialist country and a capitalist one is quite tricky. But this happens in the West, you know, that an American company might have difficulty coping with labor laws within the context of Europe. So this happens, and so to alleviate that, there is this free economic zone, I don't know what it's called exactly. And so all of these profits have been pumped back into the system. Of course, you know, people are allowed to become rich in China, and most families have. You know, it's been a massive development, so fast-paced, generational. You know, one generation were peasants, and now they are buying properties, and, you know, this is a phenomenal change in most cities. So this is one tactic, this has enabled China to develop economically and surpass the US, because we have now become dependent on them. And then at the same time, they've worked out that if they want to equalize the world, and of course every country operates, this is a state principle, every country operates on its own national interest. And it just very conveniently found that, not conveniently, this is a Marxist principle too, that lifting up the global south and making these investments, offering a better deal to global south countries than the West were offering, would help to equalize economically, take down their competitors. So it's a combination of national interest, and it's also benefiting us all. So that's why global south countries will not speak against China. They will take those deals because they're better than deals neo-colonial deals that were keeping most of the world beholden to Western interests. And so this is their strategy. And then you have issues that result from this. And I think that, I was speaking to somebody in Zimbabwe the other day, and they said, I'm a Marxist, I support China, I understand what they're thinking, but I'm not happy that every day people come into my office and they say Chinese companies are affecting us. What can we do about that? And the answer is not to attack China exactly, but to recognize that it's a problem, because although your government will, of course, take a Chinese deal over a Western one, that's the sensible thing to do. It's a company, it's a big capitalist company, and it's coming to your country, it's going to affect your environment. So take an oil deal, for example, that you need to negotiate with that company for a good build and a good extraction plan. Otherwise, you're going to have serious environmental devastation. And there's going to be conflicting interests like trade union disputes. And in Latin America, this was very substantial. You had so many different competing entities. You had trade unions representing private workers, trade unions representing public sector workers. You had the indigenous peoples who lived on the land, And those people who benefited nationally from getting those resources out, to benefit the entire country. You had farmers who would rather be farming the land. And you had a government that was progressive. In the case of the pink tide governments, it was progressive. It was of course, the most progressive government that these different movements had ever experienced, but they still had to fight each other. And in the midst of this, you have a Chinese company offering the bid on this oil deal. And there is absolutely nothing there's nothing contradictory about holding that, yes, you have to fight them. You have to work out how that oil deal is going to affect you and campaign against that Chinese company, but at the same time recognize that that Chinese deal is the best deal you've ever been offered. Yeah. But you still have, you have to fight your government for better protections and for environmentalist solution. Yeah. So this is the complexity of the complaint against so-called Chinese imperialism. Yeah. I don't think that they are an imperialist country, because really they don't have that same incentive. As I said earlier, the capitalist state requires growth and needs to move into these markets. China has created a system where it does not need to move into markets. It can create cooperation between countries. That's what's making it rich. Cooperation. For the first time we have this model. And this means that we can for the first time think about things like sustainability and green technologies. And, so actually these are very inspiring times. The thing is that the countries that have the most forward-thinking policy on environmentalism are those with the most to lose, the countries that are being affected. And China is one of them. We don't take responsibility for the fact that all of the production in the world is taking place in China. We just blame them for a global pollution crisis that is obviously affecting them the most, because they are there and we are not. And they're the ones who have to find a solution to, because as you know, it's most of the production in the Western world is being carried out there. And, you obviously the cost of outsourcing is well known, and all they've done differently is to make it work for them in a way that outsourcing has never actually benefited a country before. They have made it work for them. They've taken on this burden. And as a result, we should take more responsibility for problems affecting China. But as a result, really, they are now the leaders in green technology. And so Sweden's arrogance on this matter, I don't know where it comes from, because if I was looking at green tech, green solutions and urban planning developments, I would be looking at China and also other countries in Latin America. They've got some very interesting green solutions, because those environmental disasters were affecting them long before they were affecting us.
The notion of a perfect economy, at least as a political project, remains inadequate to place beyond Marxist investigations so far. Perhaps this conversation was able to place some perspectives for you to think about, and maybe even begin your own questioning for a systems change, or not. But if you do have any thoughts and you would like to advance these conversations, do comment in the chat. And for those of you who stayed till the end, cheers, family.